Hello and welcome to Minor Compositions. For today's episode, we are joined by Michael Shane Boyle. I'll just call you Shane. Hello,
Hello.
and Elaine Ho.
Hello.
And so the idea of today is we wanted to do an episode around your new book, Shane, The Arts of Logistics, Artistic Production, and Supply Chain Capitalism. And that's why I also thought it'd be interesting to invite along Elaine, who and her projects like logistics and display distribute does a lot of interesting work which overlaps with the kind of areas you're unpacking and exploring in the book. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's the basic setup. So maybe as a sort of like a starting point, can you give this sort of audience sort of a general idea about what you're exploring in your book, and then we go from there?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you again for inviting me to chat with Elaine and you about the book and also Elaine's work. I'm really looking forward to it. Minor Compositions has published some of the most interesting and exciting and for me important books about logistics, and so this makes a lot of sense in lots of ways. So the book, like you said, it's called The Arts of Logistics, and it really has kind of two aims, I like to say. The first is to try to think about how the reorganization of capitalist production through global supply chains over the past half century, 70 years, has impacted the way that art gets made and gets produced. Um, but the second aim is to try to think about and chart the role that art has played in giving form to the actual infrastructure that supply chain capitalism relies on today. And so, whereas some books might, some people who are interested in the overlap between art and logistics might approach the topic by thinking about how artists try to represent logistics in their art, like taking photographs of shipping containers, for instance, or mapping supply chains and creating interesting documentaries about that. I'm really interested in how artists themselves actually make use of logistical technologies, how they actually make art using things like shipping containers, oil barrels, how they make performances with drones, how they try to salvage, for instance, merchant ships and make museums or art galleries out of them. Um, my book is also quite different than other approaches to this topic because it's not an industry history of how, say, the art world has been reorganized by logistics in the ways that like art storage and art transportation has been transformed. Instead, I'm really, really interested in thinking about the way that art has very much become embedded within logistical infrastructure. And I'm very interested in how artists repurpose and refunction these supply chain tools for other ends, namely art. That's kind of the book in a nutshell.
No, it's a good place to start because one of the things I instantly think about is one point that we all share in common is an engagement with the work of Stefano Hardy and Fred Moten. And when we were working on the Undercommons, uh, the original one of the original book cover drafts was based around pictures I took of Trinity Buoy Wharf,
Hmm.
um, which is an area in East London where you have shipping containers that have been repurposed into almost like studio spaces, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And that figures importantly in my book because it's kind of the origin site of shipping container architecture. And in around 2000, you have the first kind of monstrosities of buildings built out of shipping containers in a formerly in an area that once was kind of the heart of the London Docklands, but which obviously was wound down as a result of containerization, which moved the port of London out of London itself.
Mhm. And it's interesting. The reason why Fred and Stefano didn't like that cover design is basically they said it was taking logisticality too literally, and it was a bit too on the nose, and they wanted to be more metaphoric about it.
Hmm, hmm.
Or I guess as you would say, looking at this two interaction of how sort of like yeah, how logistics is shaping art, and art is sort of prefiguring or shaping logistics. So it's this sort of like back and forth between superstructure and substructure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in thinking because there's so much talk out there about, on the one hand, kind of not so much overblown statements about what art can do when it represents logistics, but oftentimes that focus on thinking about what representations of logistics can do kind of overlooks the fact that art itself is already embedded in logistics. And so I think it's interesting what you said about that Stefano and Fred might not have wanted that as the cover of their book because it's the connection is to, from what I understand, thinly mediated. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think basically it was almost like it was too direct or too obvious. It was
Mm,
it's saying taking logisticality as being taking the shipping container and making it into a space rather than actually being the social process and underlying process of how you make stuff
I
that
see. Yeah.
is logistical. And that might
And
be an
that,
interesting point to bring Elaine in because I think that's a lot of
yeah.
what you do is exploring almost like logistical patterns as aesthetic practice. Is that a fair reading?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the difficulty with, and I had a hard time actually while reading Shane's book of how to categorize what we do as whether it's a form of artistic production that sort of stems from logistics, or is it logistics, a logistics that becomes an art prediction? And I think there's a slightly ambiguous kind of realm that you're playing with. It sometimes I found a little bit hard to grasp, but in a way, the way that those things are intertwined is also part of your thesis. And I would say, how this embedding makes it whether the flow of goods is the artwork or whether the artwork is flowing.
Mm,
I think this can be read in either way. So.
yeah. I mean, Elaine, I would love to, maybe this would be a good opportunity for you to introduce some of your work because I think it's what you do with light logistics seems to be, it resonates really well with what I describe as the logistical mode of artistic production, i.e., artists who kind of reuse techniques and systems and technologies that were geared to support kind of the flow of goods and supply chains. But your work also kind of breaks with that because it's less respectful, it's less obsequious. It's also trying to, it's not quite counter logistics, but it does play with Moten and Harney's idea of logisticality, which could be really interesting to get into. But could you describe some of your work? That'd be.
Well, the Light Logistics project is quite simple, actually. It was really coming also out of our work with independent publishing and being based in China, Hong Kong region. I think that a lot of the questions that we were facing or that we look at have to do with the movement of goods across this border between China and Hong Kong, and most especially kind of a grassroots kind of way of carrying goods over, or the way that kind of small sellers take advantage of global markets, but in a local way.
Mm,
And we sort of basically kind of juxtapose these concepts or the aesthetics and the ways of moving, literally moving the goods across a border into our work with publishing. So it was basically just a simple way to get books out and to share them with people in a way that is difficult for small scale publishers who, when your books are often very cheap, it costs more to send them than it costs to produce the book. And so this kind of became a way to support grassroots publishing, but also make a project of it in and of itself, and to follow those flows. And yes, inspired by kind of the way of documentation or the way of tracking that you would find in, large scale career companies, but in a completely non-technological way. So it becomes much more actually about the social practices of this networking of bringing people together, and the kind of non-important details that that usually are disregarded when you see tracking of packages. We're more interested in all of the kind of useless, so to speak, useless information that moves along with the book, or moves along with the sort of with the psychogeography in a way of the people who are helping us to carry books.
mm,
So that's kind of what the project is about.
mm.
the thing that reminds me of I'm gonna forget the name of the artist in your book, Shane. But it's an artist who is trying to move a series of oil barrels across a border.
Yeah, Lydia Ormain, her sculptural project, The Third Choir.
And it's super interesting because the first response is, why do you want to move these oil barrels? They have no value. And then it's almost like the practice becomes not necessarily the moving itself, but like what happens when you attempt to move oil barrels.
Hmm.
And then it brings up all these frictions and brings up all these dynamics that are not important, but you wouldn't think about outside of having tried to move the oil barrels.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, Lydia Ormain, she's an artist who's born in Algeria, then moved in the late 90s or early 2000s to England. And partly her family was trying to escape kind of civil war there. Um, and she went to art school at Goldsmiths, and for her degree project, she created the Third Choir, which is I think about 20 oil barrels that she tried to transfer from Algeria to London. And then she was going to put them on display, and she had kind of this very layered sound component to the project. And she specifically wanted to transport naphthol barrels, which is the domestic name of the um, petroleum industry within Algeria, and naphthol barrels actually, because it's just within Algeria that business operates. These barrels never move outside of Algeria. When they move outside, they usually get repackaged into, say, like Shell barrels or BP or something like that. So she was really interested in, I said, what would happen if I ship these oil barrels from Algeria in a shipping container and put them on display? And part of it was a comment on the desire of the third generation after independence in Algeria, of so many people around her age wanting to leave Algeria because of both economic reasons but also political reasons and other things. And so she in 2014, she had arranged for these barrels to be moved. She found them all in Algeria. And then when she tried to send them to London, Customs said, nope, you can't do that. And it was partly because, as she found over many, many attempts to try to ship these and repeatedly have her applications rejected, is because there were very strict laws in Algeria around cultural pillaging. So because she was saying that these were artworks, they couldn't actually leave the country. And so she had to negotiate, and she had to end up getting in touch with I think the Minister of Culture to actually get them to move, to get kind of an exemption to this law, saying they will only become artworks once they are actually in transit. And so for her, it became really interesting about not just what it means to make workflows flow, but as you said, all the different kinds of friction that are entailed by flow. And she was really interested in thinking about how she might make artwork around that friction, which is not just about this specific bureaucratic blockage that she experienced, but which has ties to longer histories of empire, colonialism, etc. And she ended up creating a work that had the barrels actually on display, and you can see it at Tate Britain now. It was purchased by Tate Britain. But as important are just binders and binders full of documents of applications for export, letters that she wrote to the Minister of Culture, and emails in which she lies about what she's trying to send, lots of other things. It becomes about not just the physical movement of goods, but all the other kind of often invisibilized, dematerial or immaterial labor that makes things move, but also the histories of empire that create the blockages that might seem like they would kind of impede flow, but which nonetheless are kind of the rubber to the road of global trade.
Um, Elaine, when you've been working on sort of like moving texts around, have you had sort of like any, I mean, maybe not the same, but like, have you come up with similar kinds of like blockages or frictions encountered just trying to move some books around, or are books slightly less frictiony to move than oil barrels?
I mean, for sure, it's a different scale of friction. But because our work is, totally reliant on volunteers or people who are just willing to help, and sometimes us kind of begging happenstance travelers to help us out. things happen all the time. I have actually now books that are stuck in London and they just need to get to another place in London. But because I can't track down the courier anymore, she stopped replying to me. I have no way to to access this anymore.
Oh
So
no.
those kind of stoppages of communication, or I mean, one of the main reasons why we started this project is again about the Hong Kong and China border. And the reason for that is you're not allowed actually to send books from Hong Kong to China. Even if you have a receipt and even if they're official publications, it's just simply not allowed by courier companies. And so the only way you can do it is then by hand carrying them across the border, in which you face the risk of them being checked for content and being censored or taken away. So that has happened a couple times. We haven't had books confiscated because usually there are small ways to sort of get around this, especially if they're English, for example. The guards can't read the English books, or you kind of embed them within a bunch of other books, so they kind of get lost in the mix of all your other luggage. But these are all parts of the process that we also try to document. And then that embedded sort of slowness with things not happening, because we don't have a very smooth and efficient sort of system. That if slowness can be considered that kind of friction, then that is also actually completely immersed within the project.
It is the missing courier in London a fault, or is it actually a wonderful aesthetic moment? I'm thinking here back to the third choir again, like if the oil barrels would have just shipped smoothly, like at the first try, it would have been it wouldn't have been the same piece. It would have been something completely different, right?
Yeah, it
So
would
it's
have been
almost
it would have been a piece entirely about this oral history project she did with people around her age in Algeria who were hoping to emigrate. It wouldn't have been necessarily about logistics and supply chains. It would have been, but in a very different way.
so
Think on that level, what's so interesting about that is then how um, the kind of mess of administration was able to be made visible, because you probably, I mean, that she might not have considered all of that paperwork as part of the artwork in the beginning, but because of that accumulation of a blockade in paper or communicative form, then that almost becomes a certificate of endorsing this artwork, so to speak.
Exactly. And there's a long art history that she's referring to, this going back to histories of conceptual art in which, artists and curators would just display the designs and documents for creating works rather than actually the works themselves. So she's playing into this much longer history. But what I find so fascinating, what I love about this work, and it's quite different than a lot of the other art that I discuss in the book, because a lot of the other work that I discuss in the book, is very kind of complicit in the kind of smooth operations of logistics in various ways that we can probably talk about later. But this work I find really interesting because it's both a comment on supply chains, logistics, and friction. It's also a comment on art history and kind of revising some of these histories to embed kind of histories of decolonization, anti-imperial struggle into these ready-made aesthetic forms, such as conceptual art display, which I find fascinating and really exciting.
I was actually surprised to hear that the barrels did make it in the end, because I remember reading about this work, I think at the time that it came out, and all I actually remember were the documents and the difficulty. So I actually thought they'd never made it and that it was purely the documents. So
yeah, I mean, and part of that is the fact that at openings, both at Goldsmiths and then later on when it was in galleries, she created a performance around the work in which she just read these like 900 and a sample of the 912 or something documents that were required in order to get these oil barrels to move. So part of that is her own doing and her attempt to try to say that, yes, there are these physical objects that are really important in these technologies, but also we need to see all the other stuff at work. And that's one thing that kind of draws me to go back to, Stephen, one of your earlier points about, the kind of thinly mediated connection of art made from these technologies is the fact that oftentimes we can get really focused and kind of caught up in just the material fact or even the aesthetic fact of these technologies like drones or shipping containers or these massive container ships and not think to look behind what helps make them move, the histories that are involved, all the different kinds of labor and work and maintenance and repair that's required. And so that's something that I think that this work, the third quadrant, I'm so glad you brought it up, kind of really brings up because you have the oil barrels on display, but what she's really interested in is all the other stuff that is required to get these physical objects there. But also at the same time, somewhat playing with us, and you might be really interested in this kind of very minimalist form and just be interested in how cool or interesting these barrels look, even though they're so simple. But then again, like you were saying, Elaine, she's primarily foregrounding all of the other stuff that went into it, and I think it's a really exemplary piece of what artists can do when they try to critically engage with this infrastructure.
I wonder if this case, if you could actually credit the customs office as a collaborator accidentally or an involuntary collaborator.
Yeah, I mean, they are these ready-made systems that she's engaging with, that she engaged with. And Elaine, it sounds similar with your work. You are trying to, well, I guess your work is quite different because you are engaging with some ready-made systems and blockages and all of that, but at the same time, you're not reconfiguring them in the same kind of direct way. You're in some ways, if we go, because in reading about some of your work and some of what you've written about it, you talk a lot about logisticality, which is this other Hardy and Moten idea, which isn't so much, which I find to be different than, say, counter logistics, which is an attempt to just radically block and shut down and subvert logistics. Whereas logisticality for Hardy and Moten, at least the way I understand, is kind of not a subversion, but a perversion of logistical science, logistical tools, that sort of thing. It seems like you're kind of working more in that mode.
Yeah, I would say so. I think that the idea of piggybacking off of, for example, people moving in the art world, and the extreme amount of travel that involves with people going to art fairs or biennales, and that being, I guess, the beginnings of some of our network and ways that we've sort of been able to tap this project into our artistic practice is exactly that kind of logisticality. It's like engaging with a system that's already in place, which is also dependent on smooth and efficient travel and logistics. But then us doing that in a kind of, as you say, like slightly subversive or kind of tongue-in-cheek manner. Same as Stephen is doing with the post.
Well, it's funny because one of the ways that Minor Compositions operates is we work with certain printers precisely because they can print both in the UK and the US. So it's almost like trying to avoid the question of having to get things over borders, particularly post-Brexit, because now there's all sorts of extra import-export taxes.
Yeah.
I mean, one point I was also thinking about in commonality is I was thinking again about Sylvia Federici and her and the Wages for Housework stuff, particularly the way she would argue that the point of the Wages for Housework campaign was almost to give visibility to a certain kind of reproductive labor that had been sort of like submerged. So it almost seems like certain kinds of logistical art production are trying to foreground these activities, whether they're administrative or whether they're transport. I mean, they're not like social reproductive as in like carrying labor, but they are sort of like backgrounded labor that keeps a system functioning.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting. This topic of social reproduction has come up several times when I've been presenting and talking about the book over the past month or so. People have asked a question like this, which I find exciting because, I mean, yeah, at first glance, you wouldn't think that logistics and domestic work or carrying work have much in common, but I would say capitalism depends for social reproduction on both in really important, but also radically different ways. And the fact that capitalism today depends so heavily on logistics, I don't think is necessarily a good thing either for capitalism or for us, because supply chains are built not necessarily, or not actually not at all, to support human life, but to support human life as a means for an end of securing rates of profit. And so I think, on the one hand, the fact that supply chains now kind of dominate the way in which social reproduction works by scattering what we need to live across the world is both a bad thing for humans and the environment, but also really kind of, for lots of very kind of Marxological reasons I won't get into, not great for value production moving forward. But I'd say the other thing that's really similar, and you pointed to this about the relationship between, or the connection between domestic work and logistics, is both of these kinds of labor are very much devalued. So domestic work is devalued because, many forms of carrying labor either aren't paid or are paid just really miserable wages. And logistics work is devalued because capital tends to approach logistics as what Marx calls an unavoidable evil. Okay, so logistics work in most cases is going to be a drag on profits. It's absolutely essential for many forms of production, especially supply chain capitalist production, in which you have production, its main organizing form is not necessarily the assembly line, but the supply chain. And so in that case, logistics work is really important, but capital will always want to try to drive down the costs of that work, or parlay that, or somehow kind of use that as a way to create a trade-off so that they can, even though it might cost a whole lot of money to start sending stuff from, say, Guangzhou to Texas, if you can kind of if there's a trade-off there that allows you to, say, drive down the price of labor for producing, say, an air conditioner in China, well, then we're going to do that because that'll increase kind of profitability overall. So the two things that connect domestic work and logistics in terms of social reproduction are, on the one hand, capitalism is utterly now dependent on both forms of labor, but also capital is constantly trying to devalue it in whatever way possible so as to kind of keep profit rates up.
I think I remember reading that you mentioned this about as a sort of the paradoxical impulse of both logistics and capitalism. And I guess I would have a question about whether you see then logistics as a mirror or a facilitator? Or is it that in talking about artistic production, using the artistic production as a kind of way to analyze logistics, is it that are we kind of echoing then this systematization of violence, and at the same time that you're constantly accumulating profit, or that people are constantly accumulating profit? Or is it that we feel that we have the possibility to think otherwise through using the same systems?
It sounded a bit Brechtian, almost like logistics. Is it hammer, or is it mirror, or is it very tiny hammer that functions also as mirror?
Well, I'm glad you bring in Brecht here, because essential and fundamental to my entire argument is trying to think about reconfiguration. And Elaine, I think this speaks to what you were raising, and Brecht had a lot to say about reconfiguration. He called it social refunctioning of existing apparatuses or institutions or technologies for other ends, and say what capital might have designed them for. So the thing that I'm fundamentally interested in this book, both politically and aesthetically, are the limits of reconfiguration. So that is, on the one hand, that means I'm interested in what artists who are attempting to, say, reconfigure existing supply chain tools, what can be done with that stuff aesthetically, but also what can be done with that stuff to kind of promote critical reflection on how, as you said, these paradoxical impulses, Elaine, of supply chain capitalism, that it's organized to promote social coordination and sustain life, but for the point of furthering the pursuit of profit, no matter the actual cost for humans or the environment. So on the one hand, I'm really interested in that critical impulse of some of these art practices. And I think Lydia Oramine is a really good example. At the same time, though, a lot of the art that I study, the reason why these artists are allowed to actually play with these tools is because they're hired by, say, warehouse management startups to experiment with their new drone technology and create an installation at Tate Modern that kind of shows off this work, or they are invited by, say, the Israeli shipping firm Zim to sail aboard their container ships and make art on these boats. And then there's lots of other ways in which there's a lot of complicity between the art world and logistics, some of which is really, really mediated, and some of which is very crass and very direct in terms of the supports that artists provide logistics infrastructure, especially when, and the most obvious is when, artists are literally taking money and kind of helping to helping these startups to experiment with and play with their technologies. But the other thing with reconfiguration that I'm interested in, the reason why I'm interested in this topic or this technique specifically is not just because I'm interested in art, but I'm interested in these broader debates on the left about what's called the reconfiguration thesis. So this debate that's been going on for at least a decade, probably quite a bit longer, in which theorists, activists, organizers on the anarchists and socialist and communist left have been arguing about the potentials for reconfiguring this massive global supply chain apparatus for other ends. Like, is it possible to actually reconfigure whether it be like a container ship or a port or individual smaller technologies for other ends in, say, capitalism might have envisioned. So kind of the key figures in this debate are Alberto Toscano and Jasper Burns, who about 10 years ago kind of started engaging this much bigger political debate over the possibility to reconfigure logistics infrastructure. And where I come out is I say, okay, actually the people that have probably done the most to experiment with and explore this reconfiguration thesis practically are artists, actually, because they've done the most to try to kind of play with these technologies and to see what can happen with them. And what I end up saying in the book is I say that, okay, so a lot of these examples are really interesting, might allow us to reflect critically on supply chain capitalism. But in the end, none of these should be understood to be a handbook for what can be done with logistics. If anything, they should be kind of a cautionary tale of what's to come if we should just kind of blithely believe that these technologies, these infrastructures that capitalism set up can just be easily transformed like that. In fact, instead, and this is what Burns and Toscano end up arguing, despite their disagreements, where they end up agreeing, is like any attempt at reconfiguration, the test of those attempts will be in struggle. We just can't assume that this is going to happen. So that's a long answer to your question about thinking about where artists stand in here, and also bringing in Brecht as well, because Brecht himself was very ambivalent about, he thought that, say a theater or the radio could be used by or could be seized by communists, but he didn't think that there was any guarantees as to what then would come from that. That, say, for instance, the Nazis or capitalists might then be able to kind of undermine or defang those attempts and kind of reconfigure them again.
Well, isn't that where sort of the idea of, I can say the German word, where the idea of the alienation effect comes in, where you're using the theater, but you're almost like breaking the pretense of it being theater and actually like undoing the sort of fourth wall and saying, actually, this is the mechanism we're using.
So I think that's really useful to bring in, because Brecht, he invented this, or he didn't invent, but he kind of popularized this idea of the alienation effect, where you have where you insert formally some weird things into, say, a play that makes the audience realize, oh, we're just watching a play, therefore we should think critically about what we're seeing in front of us. Those techniques, while very much we attribute them to Brecht and kind of a communist theater project. Obviously, these alienation techniques are used all the time in Hollywood films, in advertising. And so for what Brecht would say, yeah, you have these formal techniques that are really interesting, but the most important thing is actually your control over the apparatus itself. That
Mm.
if you have no control over the apparatus, then these formal techniques can just be used for whatever purpose, you know, is available. So they can be defanged, they can be reused for, selling Coca-Cola or something like that. So this is a lot of the art that I study. It might have a critical sheen to it. It might seem like it's offering a critique or very explicit critique of logistics or helping us to understand something about it. But actually, we can't really appreciate actually how much it's embedded in logistics, what supports it might be providing, say, supply chain capitalism, without actually trying to think about the actual conditions of possibility that allowed for this work to be created in the first place. That kind of infrastructural analysis is where I think we should begin.
One example I really liked in the book and thinking about engaging with, reconfiguration is less the more crass examples, more who's the artist? Uh, Nita Sinocrat.
Yeah, Nita Sinocrat. Yep.
The Jonah's Whale project where she's dissecting shipping containers and pulling apart the sort of like histories of usage and on how they've been used and reused. And to my mind, that sort of like is about the sort of limits of reconfiguration. What are they being? Is it being reconfigured or just put to a different use, which is for different goals?
Yeah. So Nita Sinocrat's project was created in 2014. Nita Sinocrat is a Palestinian American artist who has done a lot of work in film, but also in sculpture. And what he did is he went to the West Bank, and he's actually based in the West Bank for a time. I think he's still he has some projects now that are ongoing in the West Bank. And what he did was he found a shipping container in a junkyard that had a really interesting history of use. On the one hand, it had started off being used in the way that any shipping container is to move goods around the world. But then it was decommissioned, and Israeli settlers started using this shipping container and other shipping containers like it as a way to create illegal settlements. They would when say settlers wanted to create an outpost in the West Bank, they wouldn't just start building houses from scratch. They would oftentimes do it in fits and starts. So they might move in a shipping container onto a plot of Palestinian land and start living there. Then they'd bring in more shipping containers. Then they'd bring in electricity. Then they'd build roads. Then they'd start building houses. So shipping containers, as part of the settler project, are really infrastructurally important. And that's one thing Nita was interested in. That the shipping container had started off shipping goods, then was used as a settler caravan. Then it stopped being used as a settler caravan and was itself reconfigured into a construction office for a Palestinian construction company in Ramallah, or sorry, in Jerusalem. And he was saying, okay, so on the one hand, there's this history of use in this one shipping container that's really interesting. We might see something like a libertary use of, moving from a settler caravan to a Palestinian construction office. But he's actually really critical of the specific Palestinian construction projects in both Jerusalem and the West Bank, and that they are kind of a lot of these are capital backed and are not necessarily in solidarity with Palestinian liberation, but part of a certain kind of Palestinian National Authority project of gentrifying the West Bank so as to kind of secure a certain kind of detente for the middle class and a certain kind of affluent capital lifestyle rather than actually creating a liberatory project of Palestinian sovereignty over the land. So what Nita ended up doing was he took this shipping container, he sliced it into, I think, 10 parts and just displayed it in its parts on a former Israeli base in the West Bank. And he's since displayed it elsewhere. And part of what he's trying to do is he's trying to, on the one hand, show the layers of the histories of the ways in which this shipping container has been reconfigured. And at the same time, he's trying to say that actually there's a limit to actually knowing all of the histories of this use. In fact, there's that in some ways this aesthetic fascination and even this political fascination with reconfiguration can itself be a diversion from the actual political work that needs to be done. So I find Nita's work to be similar to Lydia Ormaine's, to be really inspiring and really kind of affective in that way.
Hmm. Maybe as a follow-on question from that, when there are, how do I say, if there's a moment when the aesthetic fascination with engaging with materials or engaging with these histories starts to pose a block to the political work, how do you then engage with the aesthetics so as to not do that? I mean, or is it
Yeah.
just like it's complicated?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult, and I'd love to hear from Elaine to go back to this topic of reconfiguration, how she navigates this, or how you negotiate this, because you're obviously playing with some ready-made systems, but again, you're not. I wouldn't say your work is at all complicit in the way that a lot of the work I talk about is, but you are very aware of kind of both the limits and the frictions of these systems, and you make both like. Use it to good aesthetic effect, but also really good practical effect as well, just to get this stuff done.
I have one project that we did some years ago that I guess I thought would be an interesting example of, in a way, that collision and response to politics. And this happened with being invited to participate in an exhibition at Parasite, and kind of a long run independent project space in Hong Kong. And at the time that we were invited, there was another exhibition on. And when we looked at the exhibition and also the exhibition kind of booklet catalog, we noticed a G4S logo in the back. You know,
Yeah.
G4S, the
Yeah.
securities company, right? And this seemed a bit strange, you know, why there would be a G4S logo on this at an independent art space in Hong Kong. And so we dug a little bit deeper and found out that G4S had sponsored the logistics for that particular show. And the reason for this, which is quite interesting, is because G4S has so many outposts in all over the world, I think it made it kind of a smooth and easy transition for them to get into art logistics. So they also do art logistics as well as host art art storage spaces. They have facilities in Hong Kong and I'm sure many other places, along with the slew of kind of guards and controversies involved with G4S over time. And so in a way, as an opposition to this, what we did for our participation in the next exhibition was to say, we don't approve of this, working with a company like G4S. And so why don't you let us do the art logistics for you instead? And so our project involved basically trying to suddenly become the handlers for all the other artists in the exhibition, and to manage getting their artworks to Hong Kong. And that ranged from New York to Belgium to Hong Kong, but also just from China and locally in the city. But of course, ours being a very kind of clumsy and inefficient endeavor, this was a crazy and very funny task, but that also relied a lot on chance. And so I think in that way, as you said, it's something that's being very aware of what we're critical of in the system and trying to respond to that, but doing it in a way where hopefully there are other values produced through this sort of movement of things in a dumb way, you know, to follow to place these other value systems upon existing systems. I think that is sort of the main point of what we're trying to do. And I think that question of like other values, and if we're not able, I think what your thesis of, you know, talking about the limits of reconfiguration, somehow it's a little bit it makes me, it feels a little bit bleak sometimes. And I think there's a basic fundamental question about what art can do, you know. And I think that sort of slow process of reconfiguring value, whether or not we're actually changing the infrastructure, or we can actually block the pipeline or block anything, is where social reproduction kind of coincides with logistics, I think, and capitalist production. So that's why it remains a very slow and invisible process in a way. We don't think about our values all the time, especially when you're like ordering something on Amazon, for example,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what you're pointing to is the fact that the limits of what art can do. I mean, that is something that drives a lot of my work. I'm in the humanities, of course, that's something I'm going to be interested in. But I'm interested in thinking about that limit also as an opportunity to link up with people working in other ways, in other fields, in other spheres, other sectors, and to think about how artists themselves don't just kind of seclude themselves in these biennales and think that that is the only space in which they can operate, in which they can intervene. But it's kind of it's a constant compulsion and requirement to then kind of engage in struggle outside of the art world. That's fundamentally the thing that I'm interested in, and that's both how I begin in the book and end the book in terms of thinking about where art and blockades come together, and to think also about kind of the care work and the blockade as something that requires care in order to reproduce. And so a lot of what you're saying really resonates with the way that I'm thinking about the limits of art. And to go back to Stephen, your question that prompted this, to think about that, in some ways, so much of the art that I write about does really interesting things and aesthetically, and often has some really interesting critical insights to offer us about logistics. And many of these works also help to map logistics in really emboldening ways. But and this is the easiest thing for an academic to say, but that's not enough. That actually there needs to be more here.
One thing that reminds me of, and I'm blanking on the name of the artist. Maybe Elaine will help me remembering this. I remember visiting Parasite, and I want to say it was 2017. There was an exhibition on about it was a person who was doing solidarity work in court for people who had been arrested as part of the Umbrella movement, and it was all sketches and notes and drawings done during the court solidarity work. And what's interesting about it is it wasn't like aesthetic. I don't think it was meant to necessarily aestheticize, like, supporting someone in court, but it's almost gesturing towards, here's all the work of support that goes into this, and acknowledging it, and almost like making that more visible in the same way. Not to like assess it, but almost. I'm actually not sure what they were trying. Do you know who I'm talking about, Elaine?
It sounds familiar. I'm not sure, but I can't remember the name also.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. No, but I'm just thinking because on that point of making a gesture of this is not enough, but almost like when you say that this is not enough, the work that goes into moving beyond saying this is not enough and actually organizing, and sort of the care that goes into reproducing networks of organizing.
Yeah. Well, I think
that,
go for it.
Okay. I think the interesting thing is to acknowledge also sort of the conflicts that we address with the issue of time when we're dealing with organizing against specific or in support of very specific and urgent issues that have of course, very clear goals that need to be met, versus the idea of care work also is a very different time span, and there are lots of overlaps in between. The kind of care work that goes in occupation, like how we actually materialize ourselves in public space over a time in a place that we weren't meant to occupy, involves a different way of thinking about activism or how we address issues. And both of those things are, I think, something, those playing with this level of time is something that happens both in the way that we make art that addresses those politics, but also when you're doing it out on the street, if you're active as an organizer. And I think these are things that artists hopefully can negotiate, I think, a little bit more actively to, I guess, maneuver between the two. Somehow that I feel like there's a conflict for me, at least sometimes, the way of dealing with different issues and also what you bring from the, as you said, like that bringing court drawings into a white cube, that sometimes can be seen as a bit problematic, I think. But I'm not saying necessarily in this case, but I think the way that, people use politics as a form of imagery can be extremely problematic. And I think that that negotiation between how we use that time is not always so carefully sort of balanced.
I think something that both of you have just raised makes me think that, what something else that art can do, or why it's useful for artists to engage with logistics and supply chain capitalism, why I think it's useful for academics and critics to also be interested in this, is the fact that the rise of logistics has transformed kind of, I would say, every facet of social life over the past half century. And academics, journalists, politicians tend to talk about the way in which logistics has affected certain spheres of life in certain sectors. And one thing that I'm trying to do in this book, and Elaine, which I think also your work speaks to as well, is trying to take seriously that, okay, so we need to understand the full way, more fully, the way in which logistics has transformed literally every facet of social life. And one of those areas is itself art. And that's worthy of study and worthy of inquiry in itself, not just to understand how the art world works and how it's been reshaped and why G4S is now providing support for global art fairs. But it can also be a way for us to better understand not just the art world, but the world itself, and to figure out, to find things that are lessons, to identify openings that might be transferable or found elsewhere for us to intervene. And I think that's one thing, that the art world itself, like every other sphere of capitalist society, has been utterly transformed, and therefore understanding it is really, really potentially useful.
I think what's also interesting to acknowledge is like this idea of accidental technology, in the sense, reconfiguration at many examples in your book employ this ability for artists to make other uses out of existing technologies. Or I think the idea that a new technology is created out of an accident, or out of basically an unplanned maneuver. And this is something that, it may be, you could see this as a funny way. I think this aspect of being unplanned is important, because it seems that thus far, of course, capitalism has managed to sort of take over every possibility or swallow every kind of form of resistance. And so the accident or the unplanned or the thing that cannot be predicted is somehow, if that is something that artists have been good at doing, or is something that we need to almost ironically like try to see how to produce accidents. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important political. That's important politically, just to say that there is human agency still, and whether that human agency then itself gets reconfigured and et cetera, that's another story. But I think within the art world, it's especially important because there's so much discourse now about, materials and things and objects and those having the agency, that I think it's oftentimes easy to remember that actually, no, like humans are the ones who also have they have the capacities to intervene and to transform things, that there are openings here. So I think that's the other thing that I try to articulate throughout the book, that the prospects for a life worth living aren't just built into the technologies and infrastructures that capitalism hands us, but it comes down to what we decide to do them. And that's not to state kind of a fully voluntaristic attitude, but I think that can oftentimes be forgotten, especially like what you're saying, if we get completely overwhelmed by just how huge these systems are, that it can be very like disempowering. But we've seen so many examples over the past 10, 15 years of people finding really clever, inventive, and inspiring ways to mess with, to block, to reconfigure these infrastructures that seem like they're so completely dominant and powerful, but which, I mean, we see this with, say, for instance, Ever Given, the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. That was people were so fascinated, and there was so much schadenfreude about it. And I think on the one hand, there was kind of, and I talk about this in the book, there was some misrecognition that this was the end of capitalism. There was a lot of writing about like the Achilles heel of capitalism has been revealed. And obviously, capital is very equipped to be able to deal with those kinds of blockages. But nonetheless, I think like things like that, and I think even more purposeful attempts to kind of mess with global flows, to insert frictions, to blockade things, divert things, are themselves a really powerful reminder of what we can do when we do it together.
The thing that makes me think of, and maybe use this as a way to maybe move towards a sort of not conclusion, but maybe a pause, is I really like towards the end of your book, you say something like art produced in the logistical mode offers a chance to view infrastructure otherwise. And I really like the idea, because the point isn't necessarily the art itself. It's almost like for using art as a space to engage with thinking about infrastructuring and worlding differently. And I think that's also connects to Elaine's work here. Is the point necessarily isn't how you move books, but it's almost like how do you create other forms of social infrastructure to move things, whether they're books, people, ideas, care, etc.
There's a quote from there's a quote that I use often. It might have even been in the text that I had sent to you earlier about how culture has the least respect for borders. And I think that idea of the movement of ideas as something that we have the possibility to do tax-free sometimes. I hope at least as pirates of knowledge production, I think that possibility is maybe that glimpse of the otherwise that I hope for, at least with the work that we are all doing, I think.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, and this might be a less inspiring note than the one that Elaine just gave us. I mean, I think when we think about infrastructure otherwise, or when we think about art's capacity to that, it's also the way I tend to talk about is to think about like artists themselves are people, and they come from certain places and certain situations. They have certain lived experiences, and the art that I really find the most exciting in the book are those artists who on the one hand, find ways to kind of like mess with the system in really kind of subversive, exciting, perverted ways. But also artists who really allow us to rethink the history of logistics from a perspective of the violence, the loss, the friction that it requires. So Nita Synecrot is an excellent example in that it's his Jonah's Whale is a work that tethers together global capital, settler colonialism, weird capital-led nation-building projects all into the same exact infrastructure. And to say that there's the same, it's all kind of the same, it's all part of the same problem, and that we need, and I think that that's for me what is most exciting about the potential of art in terms of the message that it can provide, is to try to capture in like a really, really succinct, clear, and compelling and powerful way all of these things, and to kind of be able to put to package, no pun intended, to package them together, so that we can better kind of figure out that we can better orient ourselves, because otherwise we're just overloaded with tons of information. We need art that can kind of cut through the thick of it.
Cool. Well, on that thought, I'm going to say thank you both for coming along. That was super interesting.
Thank you both as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Elaine, for your work, and Stephen for all of your work with Myra compositions.